Welcome back, Motorized bike enthusiast. In today's video, I'll be giving you my first impressions of the hybrid motor from Southern Custom CC. We'll first be taking it on a nice long back road ride with some gravel and bumpy conditions in what's probably not an ideal setup for this motor. When I start messing around with these performance motors, I find myself in an awkward position. A lot of the new builders and people who have been watching my channel for a while might expect me to give some useful information, but in certain situations I don't know if I can. This is going to be first impressions not only for me, but for new builders who might be interested in a performance motor and the caveats you'll face along the way. What I'm trying to get at is, if you're an expert builder who's been into these motors for a long time and already dealt with these situations, you're probably not going to learn anything new here, but I'll try and keep it entertaining along the way. If you have any useful information to put into the comments that might help other new builders interested in a motor like this, please feel free to post away, as I'm still learning a lot and we've got a ways to go. Now, this hybrid motor from Southern Custom CC is in the budget performance category, and it shows, as there's some imperfections, but so far I don't see any glaring concerns. As you'll see throughout the video, my opinion is that this motor fills a good niche which is needed in the budget performance category, as essentially there is none, and this fills that gap. But there was some concern with certain individuals that this might be directly competing with the high-end performance motors, and that's simply not the case. This motor is not going to be able to go toe-to-toe with the performance build from DLH, Smolik Performance, or RDM. Simply not going to happen. But it is probably going to be a good stepping stone for somebody who wants to get into those performance motors and make future modifications down the road. The information provided to me when I was purchasing this motor is that it's in direct competition with the Phantom 85. Having ridden both the Phantom 85 and a hybrid on a 44 and 36.2 sprocket, here's what I can tell you so far. The Phantom 85 is still the king of low-end RPM power. Nothing beats its pull from a dead stop up to about 6,000 RPMs. However, beyond that, the hybrids take off on the pipe and will dust a Phantom 85. So that's different power ranges for different users. But keep in mind, once the Phantom 85 is released with a needle bearing and a proper expansion chamber, this could change drastically. So we'll just have to keep an eye on it. That's maybe half throttle climbing that hill. I'm trying not to rip the spokes off the bike. This is still a rag joint. I've never broken a spoke with a rag joint before, but if there's any motor that's gonna do it, I'm sure this is the one. This thing is so torquey. I got a little bit of a dead zone right when I crack open the throttle. Right there. And then a little bit further goes away. The only thing I've done different is lean out the needle, but it seemed really rich to me. So I'm not sure what can cause a dead zone. If any of you guys know, let me know. It's where it doesn't really bog, it just cuts out completely. Almost like the motor shuts off. And it's only in one spot of the throttle. See if I can do it again. I didn't get it this time. Right there. There it was. So this is like a quarter throttle. It's barely open. There's a few things going on here that lead to a slightly unfortunate situation later in the video. My own fault, I believe, but I'd like to explain because a lot of new builders who are not familiar with these motors might make the same mistake and cause themselves a slight dent in the wallet. The first thing I learned very quickly with my original hybrid build is that these motors are incredibly picky, not only about having a very precise tune, but about the actual setup of the bike itself. Heat is probably going to be the biggest enemy to anyone building one of these motors, as they're originally designed for forced air cooling and are being passively cooled on a bike, which means it limits your cruising speed, well, it limits your minimum cruising speed, to the point where I don't think a 44.2 sprocket is something that should be on a hybrid. In my personal opinion, I think 36 teeth is the minimum for your rear sprocket, and 32 is probably ideal. My reasoning for this is that it forces you to a higher cruising speed, which will give adequate cooling to the motor. I'm also going to double down on this for new builders, myself included, as I'm going to recommend getting a large aftermarket head for anyone building one of these motors, at least for the first time. I'm sure the expert builders can get away with the stock heads just fine because they know what they're doing and they have the ability to tune a carburetor properly. I tend to lack that ability. So a larger head, although a slight investment, is probably going to save your motor in the long run, at least for first-time builders. I'll be putting an aftermarket head on this motor ASAP, along with my hybrid build on the Loki bike. To make things even harder for this little motor is I leaned out the needle one notch. My first ride in last Sunday's video, I took it to work with the needle in its richest position to stay on the safe side, and it felt a little too choppy in the mid-range to keep it there. This might have been due to the lack of load on the motor with the large sprocket, or it may have been running too rich. But the mistake I made was that I adjusted the needle and I did not go back and adjust the air screw. So we're running a little too lean in the low end, or at least it sounds like it to me, and I think that's where the dead zone might be coming from. I'm led to understand that there's overlap when you're tuning the needles and the jets, so by changing the needle position without adjusting the air screw is probably what came and bit me in the butt. What I'm about to say is hopefully a favor to new builders and the sellers of hybrids, especially Southern Customs, being that before this motor hit the market, the bar to entry for a hybrid build was pretty high, unless you did all the work yourself. Whether you're doing all the work yourself or spending the coin on a hybrid motor, generally you've done the research and you're willing to accept the risk. But because this motor is going to come in at the $300 price point, the bar to entry hybrid builds has been knocked a lot lower. So inevitably, these Southern Custom hybrids are going to find their way into the hands of inexperienced builders. Myself included, of course, as I tend to just jump blindly into anything motorized bike related that I can afford. But at the very least, I'm willing to accept the risk, and when something blows up, I'm not going to give the seller a hard time about it because it's almost always my fault. And even when it's not my fault, I tend to just be too lazy to return something and end up Frankensteining it into another build. What this means is Southern Customs is probably going to have to deal with a lot of headaches from people who seize their motors or blow them up completely, simply because they lack the experience or were not willing to take the risk. If you can only afford this motor once, I wouldn't buy it. Never buy anything that you can't afford to replace. Stick with a China doll until you get a little more experience, because if you jump into this hybrid blindly and expect it to be a perfect running motor because it's sold on a motorized bike website, that's not the case. You need to know what you're doing with these. I say this for two reasons, not just to double down on what we previously talked about, but to also help you understand that these motors can have a lot of issues that are not related to the quality of the motor itself. You can actually have one with perfect parts and still give you massive headaches if you don't know what you're doing, as I quickly found out. You know, next time I come through here, I'm going to bring you a carrot. Y'all remember to remind me to bring her a carrot. I mean, you guys can hear the vibration. That hum every time I let off of the throttle, when it winds down, that's what I'm actually feeling in the bike at that exact frequency. I just can't do it, guys. I just can't hold it open long enough to see what she can do. I'm sorry, I ain't got the balls for that. One of y'all gonna have to do it. I ain't doing it. This is my never-ending battle with the repeated comments of how fast does it go, or why don't you just open it up? Well, simply put, I don't have the nerves for that. And if you want to know how fast you can get a bicycle to go with one of these motors, you're free to build it yourself and go dance with death. I've been in a handful of crashes at low speeds, 2 of which messed me up for over a month, and I'm not willing to find out how bad these crashes can be at high speeds of over 40 miles an hour. That's just not my thing. And at the end of the video, you're going to see a good reason as to why I don't go fast on these cheap motorized bikes. Even with the Loki build, which is much more expensive than these hobbled together Frankenstein messes, that's still a bike I don't fully trust to keep pinned at full throttle for very long. Of course, this comment's often followed up by, if you don't like going fast, why do you bother with performance motors? This is an easy one to reply to, the simple fact that I enjoy high power on demand. Getting up to your cruising speed quickly, doing very little pedaling to get going, and just being able to pull yourself through any situation is what I call practical power. You can enjoy a nice performance motor without trying to cheat death every second you ride it. And although it hasn't shown up in the comments, I'm sure somebody's thinking it, is if I'm not interested in top speed, what qualifies me to review these performance motors? Well, nothing, really. That's up for you to decide. You're the one still watching the video. However, I can give you some insight. If these motors require you to be pinned at full throttle most of the time, then I don't find them practical. I like the power on demand, but only if it's usable for daily driving. And there might be other builders in the same category. You want this power as well, but you don't care about top speed. We need to find out if this motor can handle cruising for daily driving. You see, the hybrids are originally designed for a CVT transmission, but on a single-speed bike, their dynamics change drastically. The CVTs will keep them under a constant load and a relatively stable RPM, but on these bikes it fluctuates quite dramatically, and they're just not originally port mapped for these motorized bikes. So, we're going to find out if they're practical for daily driving.
I seized it too lean down low. I knew I should have adjusted that air screw after I moved the needle. Let it cool off. She should be all right. She seized when I let off of the clutch, so it's kind of the same thing it did on my first hybrid. I'm not poking at anyone in particular. I've just heard some things back and forth about different intake setups for these Minarellis. How one version that's more similar to this runs excessively hot, heats up the carburetor, heats up the fuel mix. No idea if that's true. I've also heard that the G2 reed, bringing the carburetor out much further and having an extra set of spacing silicone adapters to shield it from heat, can run a bit cooler. I was gonna grab a heat gun to measure the temperature of this carburetor versus the carburetor on my Loki bike with the G2 reed. However, I don't think that's necessary because this carburetor is cool to the touch. There may be some spots that are kind of lukewarm, but yeah, that test would be pointless for this carburetor. Does not heat up with this intake, but this is its own unique intake. So there are a lot of factors that can affect this, but for me personally, I'm just going to recommend running that needle in a rich position. It might make the mid-range extra choppy, but it beats the hell out of a heat seizure. If you're new to these performance motors, this is the second time I've had a heat seizure on two different motors. These things are very picky. I mean, they're designed for forced air cooling. So if you run them too slow, you run them a tiny bit too lean, you're gonna have all sorts of problems. On the China dolls, you can get away with a lot for a long time. On these, they don't let you get away with anything. Might I recommend just going straight to an aftermarket head for better cooling? I'm not blaming the stock head for what just happened, but it certainly didn't help. I sure hate to blow up Mark's engine on its second ride. Damn fuel filter's leaking. I thought it wasn't, but it is. Kind of a good thing, because I saw some fuel on the intake and I thought I had an intake leak. To destroy that back wheel, I know it. I'm pretty sure I've already screwed it up.
So now I'm going to sum up my thoughts of the Southern Custom CC Hybrid, and then I'll give you my thoughts on hybrid builds in general, but first I want to show you something. After a few hard pulls with this motor on the Path Dragon, a bike which has already been beat to hell and back, I noticed something interesting with the rear brake. It was pulsating. At first I assumed this was just an out of true wheel, as it's quite easy to bend spokes whenever you have a performance motor or you just go through rough terrain. When I inspected the rear wheel, I found a crack on the sidewall. From time to time, I'll find critical issues on a bike, which always make me say, I'm sure glad I wasn't pushing the limits. Recently, while editing this video and helping a Discord member, I just found out that the screws on the sprocket for Loki, the 50-mile-an-hour bike, were starting to back out. That could have really sucked. And had I been pushing this bike to its limits, holding full throttle to see how fast it goes, when this crack spread throughout the rim, I probably wouldn't be here talking to you right now, as I'd probably be in the hospital. So my response to any future comments of how fast does it go will be fast enough. There's a very good reason why the majority of fast bikes you see on YouTube from users who continue to upload videos are built on very strong frames with good components, as they learned a long time ago that if that's the only question you have, you've already screwed up. So let's go ahead and talk about the pros and cons that I noticed with the Southern Customs Hybrid so far. First, as far as performance is concerned, I can't really say much as I have limited experience with hybrids. And I can't try and compare it to my Loki build because they're on such dramatically different setups it wouldn't be fair to even start and try and consider what the differences are. Each bike has a different pipe, a different carburetor, different reed valve, different sprocket, tire diameter. It's too different to try and compare these to each other, but I assume the performance is going to be similar as they're both using identical port maps on the cylinder. Starting with our cons, I only noticed two so far, the first one being the small cylinder studs of only 6mm. They're going to be considerably weaker and easier to snap off or strip out, so keep this in mind when you're torquing down your head. You could easily upgrade these to 8mm yourself, and I understand why they didn't do it at this price point. More time to bore out the cylinder for 8mm studs is more money. Personally, the biggest con that I see on this motor is the vibration. It's a bit excessive for what this motor is designed to do. As a performance motor, you need a balanced crank. This claims to come with a balanced crank, so either the balancing from the factory is off and/or the wobble we found in our crank weights is what's causing vibration. Either way, something is making this motor vibrate, and it's not the tune. This is okay for me because really in low and mid-range RPMs I don't really notice it too much, but when I rev the motor out or try and pull to a higher RPMs, you really start to feel the bike shake. What this tells me is this motor is not going to be ideal for people going for absolute top speed. However, you could address this with your own crank, but once you start getting into that, you might as well build up your own motor. Of course, that's not to say every motor will come like this. If the vibration I'm feeling is simply from the out of true crank weights and the balance is actually spot on, then you might get lucky and have a nice crank. However, as often as I see wobbly cranks in motorized bike kits, I don't have high hopes for this being fixed. Moving on to the pros. When you add an extra $120 for an adapted MZ65, bringing your price point up to about $450 for a complete bolt-on ready-to-run motor with no modifications, this thing has ample power and won't leave anyone wanting. The amount of power you get out of this motor in the entire RPM range is acceptable for pretty much any situation. You could live in an extreme hilly environment and still get away with a 36.2 sprocket. So even if you're like me and you're not after absolute top speed, this is still going to be a fantastic motor. However, if you are after absolute top speed, keep in mind that crank weight. For aftermarket modifications, you have essentially as many modifications as you would on a standard China doll, with the option to do port work and really open up this motor. After our initial inspections video, it was clear to me that the quality of every part inside this kit is about as good as you can expect to get in a motorized bike kit. That being upgraded SKF bearings, a stronger magnet, a stronger magneto, and assumedly a balanced crank, if yours doesn't come wobbly. This motor seems to sit really well with the PZ20 carburetor, which is fantastic because that is a dirt cheap carburetor at less than $20 on Amazon. You might opt to go with a PZ19. Maybe you'll have a little less grunt, but because you'll have a full set of pilot and main jets available that are easy to access on Amazon as well, you can tune it any way you want to. Once I returned the needle to its richest position, I found that the stock jetting inside the PZ seems to work really well with this. Now, I'm not a tuning expert, but I feel like the bike runs great with this carburetor setup. And personally, I think that any issues I might have with heat seizing the motor or running too hot are going to be more related to my cruising speed than the carburetor tune as I have it at the moment. Fitting this motor on a frame will be identical to a YD100. I didn't say PK80 simply because the spark plug comes straight out the top, which is more similar to what you get out of a YD100. So if the YD fits, this'll fit. This motor came with an excessively wide squish gap, but I didn't leave that in the con simply because I removed one of the base gaskets in between the cylinder and the adapter plate and replaced it with gasket maker, and that brought my squish down to 0.9 millimeters, which for me is ideal on a motor like this. The upgraded clutch spring is kind of a toss-up. It does grab really well for a stock clutch, and I had very little slipping issues, just a little tiny bit. But the downside is that it's going to put more stress on your hand. You're going to get more fatigue if you're in a situation that requires you to constantly be on and off the clutch. To sum up my thoughts on hybrid builds in general, I think it's incredibly important to do your research. Talk to as many people as you can who have previously built hybrids and dealt with all the issues. Recommendations you get from them and other builders will be valuable. It'll save you a lot of money, especially if you're on a tight budget. I know a lot of builders are not really interested in putting a hybrid on a trail bike like I'm doing in this video, but if it's something you are interested in, just note that these motors, as far as I can tell, do not like to cruise at low speeds. They just don't get adequate air cooling. You're going to be limited to a minimum of a 36-tooth sprocket in my opinion, and smaller might help you even more. If you are interested in doing something like what I have going on in this video, then definitely consider getting an aftermarket head for better cooling as soon as possible, and really know what you're doing with the tune so you don't overheat the motor. Also look into getting a temperature gauge. Ideally I would have had one on this bike, but mine broke immediately after I installed it, so I was out of luck. Try and get a good one. These hybrid motors are not for the lazy. They open up a world of potential as far as performance is concerned, but in my opinion they need to be babied to keep that performance reliable. Where a motor like this might really shine is for an individual who has some previous experience tuning, has some time to do research, but doesn't have the tooling available to make these adapters themselves and put it all together. And whereas I would like to say all the hard work is done for you, honestly I think the hard work is after you actually get it on a bike and start running. So at least for the moment, that's all I have to add about this hybrid motor. It looks promising, but it's going to be a lot of work to keep it that way. I hope you guys got some useful information out of today's video, or at the very least, were mildly entertained. And until next time, ride safe.